The only thing that you see here is poverty.
I always wonder if things are going to go really wrong and go really bad.
Do you remember what it was really like to be poor in the 1980s? The things you lived with? The moments you never forgot? Those day-to-day realities shaped how we ate, dressed, and stayed warm. Looking back now, was it just struggle? Or something more? Government cheese was not just a food, it was a memory you could taste. It came in these thick, solid bricks wrapped in cardboard that barely looked like packaging. You knew it when you saw it. And if your family ever got it, chances are you still remember exactly how it smelled. Government cheese showed up in lunches, sandwiches, casseroles, anywhere it could be sliced, melted, or stretched. It was salty, dense, and somehow both rubbery and addictive. You might not have had name-brand snacks or Lunchables, but you had grilled cheese that slapped. Most of all, it was free. You stood in line for it, or your mom did, maybe even with a baby on her hip and your little brother tugging at her coat. It was part of a larger government surplus food program, meant to support families struggling below the poverty line in the 1980s. And it mattered. It meant dinner was covered that night, or lunch was handled for school the next day. It was not fancy, and it definitely was not organic, but it was something you could count on. Ask anyone who grew up with it, and they will tell you. It tasted like struggle, but also like security. You could tell who else had it too. It was the silent nod between classmates, the unspoken, "Yeah, me too," of being broke but taken care of. You did not choose it, but it helped you get by. And honestly, it kind of hit different. Food stamp booklets were never just coupons. They were survival printed on pastel-colored paper. If you ever held one in your hand, you know the feeling. They came in booklets, with each stamp marked by a dollar value, and they looked like Monopoly money to anyone who did not need them. But to the people who did, they were the difference between groceries or going hungry. You had to use them carefully, precisely. Some stores treated you like dirt for using them. The cashier might sigh. The people in line behind you might stare. But your mom? She kept her head up and made it stretch. You could not use them for everything, though. No toilet paper, no hot food, definitely no treats. But you learned what they could buy, and you learned fast. Powdered milk, canned beans, off-brand cereal. Maybe a block of cheddar if you got lucky. It was humbling, sure, but it also taught you about budgeting before you even knew what that word meant. And let us be real, the embarrassment never fully faded. Kids at school noticed. "Oh, your mom used food stamps?" Like it was an insult. But the truth is, it meant your family found a way. It meant your parents were doing their best with what they had. And you learned how to be resourceful, proud, and quiet about the things other people took for granted. That paper had power, even if nobody else saw it. Using the oven for heat was not safe, but when it got cold and the furnace was broken, or worse, shut off, you did what you had to. Picture it. The kitchen light off, the oven door cracked open, and the burners running on low. You wrapped up in a thin blanket and sat near it like it was a fireplace. Not ideal. Not even close. But it was better than freezing in your sleep. The air would get dry and heavy. Your mom might scold you to be careful, and your dad might check the carbon monoxide detector, if you had one. Most people didn't. You just kept the door open and hoped it kept you warm through the night. There were times the electric bill was too much, times when the oil tank was empty, or the gas bill just did not get paid that month. And when you are poor, you do not call a technician. You get creative. You boil water for humidity. You close every door except the kitchen. You sleep with socks, sweaters, and a knit cap on your head. If your nose was cold, you pulled the covers tighter. And somehow, despite the danger and the fear, you made it work. Because you had to. And to this day, that smell, the slightly burnt warm air coming from an oven left on overnight, sticks with you. It was a warning and a comfort, all at once. Brown bag or free school lunches were not just meals. They were mini lifelines in the middle of the school day. Your lunch was either packed at home with whatever you had, or handed to you from the cafeteria, on a tray that came with a quiet kind of understanding. If you were lucky, you got a peanut butter sandwich, maybe an apple, and a little carton of milk. If you got free lunch, it might have been spaghetti in a plastic tray, or a slice of rectangular pizza that somehow always tasted amazing. Either way, it kept you going. And for kids growing up poor in the 1980s, school lunch was sometimes the only real meal of the day. Your mom made that paper bag stretch, a sandwich made with the heel of the loaf, some off-brand chips, maybe a reused butter container with pudding in it, if you had that kind of luck. There was no fancy thermos, just whatever worked. And even if the food was cold, you were warm for a moment, sitting with friends who might not know you were skipping dinner again that night. The worst part? The judgment. Kids who had brand-name snacks, packed lunches with neatly cut fruit, they noticed, but you noticed too. That lunch was a badge of survival. A midday reminder that someone was trying to take care of you. And it mattered. A lot more than people realized. Wearing hand-me-downs from older siblings or cousins was just how it worked when money was tight. If your older brother outgrew a jacket, you inherited it. If your cousin left behind a pair of jeans, they showed up in your closet next. It did not matter if they fit perfectly. You cuffed the sleeves, you rolled the pants, you made it work. Sometimes the clothes were way out of style or had someone else's name written in marker on the tag. Maybe there were holes. Maybe the knees were worn thin, but it was what you had. And back then, there was no shame in it, because everyone around you was doing the same thing. Or at least it felt like that. Getting something new meant it was new to you. If you got lucky, a neighbor or a friend of your mom's would drop off a bag of clothes on the porch, a garbage bag full of possibilities. You would dig through it with hope. Would anything fit? Would it look okay? Would kids at school make comments? The truth is, you wore what kept you warm, what lasted, and what you could afford, which often meant clothes that had already seen a few years of wear. And if anyone had a problem with that, you learned to ignore it, or laugh it off, or wear it anyway because clothes did not define your worth. Keeping butter tubs and Cool Whip containers was not just a habit, it was strategy. You knew exactly what was in that fridge. 3 reused containers that could hold anything. Soup, stew, leftover spaghetti, half a chopped onion. You opened it not knowing what you'd find. You saved every container that came with a lid because it meant you did not have to buy Tupperware. Your mom had a cupboard full of them, stacked like puzzle pieces, always threatening to fall when you opened the door. That Cool Whip container might show up in your lunchbox or get packed for a church potluck. It was the original multi-tool of poor kitchens everywhere. You knew your family had less money when there were more margarine tubs than actual margarine. It meant you made the most of everything. You reused, you stretched, you got clever. That habit never really left. Our no-brand pantry staples were a whole experience on their own. White labels, black letters, no frills, just the word beans or corn staring back at you. If you shopped with your parents in the 1980s, you remember the generic aisle like it was a secret world. It was where families on tight budgets made real decisions. You did not care if the cereal came in a bag instead of a box. It still crunched. It still filled you up. Rice, flour, sugar, all stacked in basic packaging with no cartoon mascots or flashy colors. Instead of getting 2 brand name items, you could get 5 generics. Sure, maybe your cereal turned soggy faster, or your mac and cheese had a weird texture, but it kept you full. And it let you feel normal. Yours just had it from the white box with the black label, and that was okay. You learned that food is food, and that taste matters a lot less when hunger is on the table. Getting haircuts at home, or worse, bowl cuts in the kitchen, was a rite of passage for kids growing up without much extra money. There was no trip to the barber or the salon. You sat on a stool or a dining chair and someone in your family did the best they could. A pair of scissors, a towel, and a deep breath. That was the full setup. Sometimes it was your mom, sometimes your dad, sometimes an older sibling who had watched someone do it once. Bangs too short, uneven sides, a mysterious line on the back of your head. You would look in the mirror and sigh. That was the whole point. Haircuts cost money, money that could go to groceries, gas, or school supplies. And if your family had more than one kid, everyone got the same cut, like a production line. Saturday morning trims, sweeping hair off the kitchen floor. Looking back now, it is kind of sweet. That chaos haircut came from love, from doing your best with what you had. Making toys from household items was what you did when store-bought ones were out of reach. Cardboard boxes were race cars, paper towel tubes turned into swords or telescopes, a rubber band and a spoon, instant catapult. You did not have the latest action figure or dollhouse, but you had couch cushions, and those made a mean fort. You built entire worlds with what was lying around. A milk crate could be a spaceship. A shoebox became a treasure chest, and no one told you how to play, you just figured it out. Sometimes your parents helped, but most of the time, it was you versus boredom. That imagination, born out of necessity, stuck with you. You learned how to be resourceful. You did not need batteries or flashy lights. You needed time, space, and maybe some tape. They brought laughter. They gave you freedom. Playing outside until the streetlights came on was not just routine, it was the rule. That was the signal. When those orange lights flickered on, it was time to go home. You roamed the block with a pack of neighborhood kids, you rode bikes, climbed fences, and played tag in someone else's yard. No cell phones, no supervision, just scraped knees, loud laughter, and the occasional yelling mom from a porch. It was freedom, and it was free. Sticks became swords, chalk became currency. A pile of dirt was a construction site. You just needed time. You learned how to solve problems, how to get along, and how to stay out just long enough to avoid trouble. That was childhood in the 1980s. Messy, loud, full of moments no one ever filmed, but everyone remembers. Because out there, in the quiet chaos of your own little street, you felt like the richest kid in the world. Church or charity clothing drives were quiet lifelines that showed up just when families needed them most. You would walk into a community center, or maybe a church basement, and there would be folding tables lined with donated clothes, shirts, shoes, jackets, jeans, all sorted by size if you were lucky. Sometimes there were handwritten signs, sometimes just piles. You would dig through the stacks with your mom or grandma, hoping to find something warm that actually fit. If you found something halfway decent, you held onto it like treasure. It was not just about clothes, it was about dignity, about making it through the winter without freezing, about having something to wear to school that did not scream, "I am struggling." These drives meant someone in your neighborhood cared. They meant someone had your back, even if you did not know who. There were moments where you picked out a dress or a jacket that someone else had outgrown, and somehow it still felt new. Sure, it might smell like a stranger's laundry soap, but you wore it with pride. Maybe it had a patch, or maybe the zipper stuck. But it was yours. And when you outgrew it, you bagged it up and passed it on. Because that was the deal. What helped you once could help someone else next. That was the unspoken rule of growing up poor. You shared what little you had, because that little still meant a lot. Sleeping on pull-out sofas or sharing beds was just how it worked when you had more people than rooms. Privacy was a luxury. If there was a couch, it doubled as a bed. If there was a floor, it became a mattress. Pull-out sofas were these heavy, metal-framed beasts that unfolded with a creak and a thud. You would wrestle with the cushions, maybe pinch your fingers, and finally lay down on something that felt more like springs than comfort. But it beat sleeping in a chair. And sharing a bed? That was a sibling rite of passage. You argued about who got the wall side. You fought over blankets. You complained about feet touching. But in the end, you fell asleep to the sound of breathing beside you. It was closeness, forced by circumstance. And yeah, sometimes it was annoying, but it also meant you were not alone. There was a strange kind of safety in that, in knowing someone else was right there, even if they snored, even if they kicked. Those nights on the pullout or squeezed into one bed with two other kids taught you how to adapt, how to sleep through anything, how to find peace in a room filled with snoring, murmured dreams, and the hum of an old fan. You made space where there was none, because love and sleep and survival all happened in the same few square feet. Layaway at Kmart or Sears was not just a payment option. It was hope stretched over time. If your parents could not afford the full cost of a coat, a toy, or even a new pair of school shoes, Layaway gave them a way to still say yes. You would walk the aisles, pick something out, and bring it to the counter. Not to take home, but to lock away in the back. Safe. Waiting. Each week your mom or dad would go back and make a payment. $5 here, $10 there. Slowly, piece by piece, they chipped away at the balance. And when the final payment was made, you got to bring it home like it was brand new, because it was. It might have been hidden in a stockroom for weeks, but it still had that store smell, that shine, that feeling of finally having something you had wished for. Layaway meant Christmas gifts even when the money was tight. It meant back-to-school shopping without credit cards. And yeah, it meant patience. A whole lot of patience. You learned the value of waiting, of working towards something slowly. And when that layaway item finally came home, you cherished it in a way that most people never would. Because it was not just a jacket or a bike. It was a sacrifice, a plan, and a quiet victory wrapped in a plastic bag. Getting creative with school projects when you had no fancy supplies was an art form in itself. You did not have glitter, foam boards, or expensive markers. You had a brown paper grocery bag, maybe some string, a glue stick on its last legs, and your imagination. Posters were drawn with pencil and traced over with pen. Science projects were built from cereal boxes and toilet paper rolls. You scavenged for materials, empty cans, broken toys, scraps of construction paper from last year's stash. You figured out how to make a diorama with cardboard, paper clips, and wishful thinking. And when it came time to present, you stood tall, even if your volcano did not erupt or your poster sagged at the corners, because you knew how much effort it took. You watched your parents help cut, tape, and fix things the night before, even after working a long shift. There was no last-minute trip to the art store, no spare $20 bill for decorations, just grit and a lot of tape. Sometimes you got weird looks from classmates. Sometimes you got a teacher who noticed the effort and gave you a nod. Either way, you learned that it is not about what you have. It is about what you can do with what you have. And looking back, some of those rough, lopsided projects meant more than any perfect trifold ever could. The Sears catalog dreaming ritual was its own kind of holiday. That thick book showed up in the mail like magic, full of glossy pages and promises. Toys, clothes, electronics, even furniture. Everything you could want, but probably would not get. Still, you looked, you circled, you dreamed. You and your siblings would take turns flipping through the toy section, marking pages with dog-eared corners or scribbled stars. You made lists. You imagined. You believed, just for a little while, that maybe, just maybe, this Christmas would be different. And your parents? They let you dream. Even if they knew that catalog was filled with things they could not afford. They watched you with a quiet kind of hope and heartbreak. Because sometimes they managed to pull off a miracle and get one thing from that book. Just one. Maybe it showed up under the tree. Maybe it didn't. But the ritual itself, the dreaming, the wishing, the pretending, was almost as special as the gift. That catalog was not just a shopping tool, it was a time machine, a window into a better life, a reason to believe that something new might be on the way. And even now, years later, just seeing one brings it all back. The weight of it in your lap, the excitement, the longing. It was not just a catalog. It was hope printed in full color. Ice cream truck visits, when they happened, were a full-blown event. You could hear the jingle from 2 blocks away, a tinny little tune that made your heart race. You dropped everything, ran inside, begged for change. Your mom might dig through the junk drawer or check under the couch cushions. Maybe she had $1, maybe not. But if she did, you ran like your life depended on it, barefoot, out the door, the sun hot on the pavement. And when you got there, panting, sweating, you stared up at that little window like it was heaven. Firecracker popsicles, chocolate tacos, snow cones in foam cups. The truck was a rolling treasure chest. You did not go every day. It was rare, a treat. The kind of thing that happened once a month, if that. But when it did, it felt like winning. You ate slow to make it last. You compared with friends. You guarded your cone like a hawk, knowing it could fall at any moment. That joy, that 5 minutes of sticky fingers and ice cream smiles, was priceless. It was not just about dessert. It was about feeling normal, about having what the other kids had, about being part of something sweet in a world that was often sour. Watching Reading Rainbow or Sesame Street on PBS was like having a warm, familiar friend show up every afternoon. If you were home, it was on. If your parents were working or the power was still on by a miracle, the TV glowed with the colors of those shows. No cable? No problem. PBS came through with free, quality programming that made you feel seen. You learned letters and numbers, sure, but you also learned empathy, kindness, imagination. Reading Rainbow made you want to go to the library and lose yourself in a book. Sesame Street made you laugh and taught you things without ever talking down to you. You knew the characters like they were real people. Big Bird, Bert, and Ernie, LeVar Burton, they were the kind of comfort you did not know you needed until you were grown. These shows were the quiet heroes of latchkey kids and working-class households. They filled the gap when your parents were too tired to help with homework or too busy putting food on the table. They did not need a subscription, just a working antenna and a little patience. And to this day, the theme songs still hit you right in the chest because they meant safety, stability, a moment where the world slowed down and felt okay. Sitting on plastic-covered furniture was a whole sensory experience you never forget. First, there was the sound, the squeak of skin against vinyl, especially in the summer. Then the feeling, sticky, sweaty, and just a little humiliating. That couch was off limits unless you had permission. You knew the rule: no roughhousing, no eating, no sitting with dirty clothes. Because under that thick sheet of plastic was the good couch, the one your mom was saving for company, for holidays, for someday. So instead of enjoying it, you sat stiffly, legs sticking, shirt clinging to your back. If you had shorts on, forget it. Peeling yourself off felt like a full-body wax. But even with the discomfort, there was something sacred about that couch. It symbolized pride. Even if the rest of the house was cramped or old, that furniture was preserved like it was brand new. Your mom vacuumed it through the plastic. Your aunt complimented it when she visited. And you? You tried not to shift too much, hoping not to get yelled at. It was ridiculous, but also real. It said, "We may not have much, but we take care of what we've got." That plastic was a barrier between the present and the hope of better days. Metal lunchboxes with a thermos were the badge of honor for elementary school survival. If you had one, it probably featured a cartoon character, a band, or a movie you barely knew but still loved. It was dented from being dropped, scratched from being dragged, but it was yours. Inside, there was a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, maybe a bruised apple, and always that little plastic thermos with a twist-off lid. It smelled like old soup and chocolate milk, no matter how often you washed it. Sometimes the latch broke. Sometimes the handle cracked, but you kept using it because buying a new one was not an option. You saw other kids with brand new bags, matching lunch gear, maybe even a juice box. You had your box with history, with stickers, with your name scratched on the inside in shaky pen. And it did the job. It kept your lunch safe, your drink sealed, and your spot at the lunch table secured. Because that box was more than metal. It was a daily piece of home. A little reminder of where you came from, and every clank it made walking to the cafeteria, that was the sound of you holding it all together. Wearing Toughskins jeans from Sears was like joining a secret club of kids who knew what it meant to make clothes last. They were stiff at first, real stiff, like cardboard stiff. But your parents swore they were indestructible. "You'll grow out of them before they wear out," they'd say. And they were right. Toughskins were made for sliding, climbing, falling, and whatever else your day threw at them. They came in dark denim, sometimes weird colors, and always had that reinforced knee patch you could spot from a mile away. They never fit quite right. Too tight in the waist, too loose in the leg, but they held up. And in a house where you shared clothes or passed them down to younger siblings, that mattered. You knew they were from Sears. Everyone did. They were dependable, affordable, and everywhere. If you tore them, your mom patched them. If you stained them, you still wore them. They became a part of your childhood uniform. No frills, just function. And years later, when someone mentions Toughskins, you smile. Because even though they were kind of ugly, kind of uncomfortable, they were yours. And they got you through. Waiting for public access TV or Saturday morning cartoons was like waiting for magic to turn on. You had no streaming, no on-demand, no do-overs. If you missed it, you missed it. So you got up early, bowl of cereal in hand, eyes glued to the screen as the test pattern faded out. You knew the schedule like a ritual. Cartoons first, the good kind, Looney Tunes, the Smurfs, maybe some He-Man if you were lucky. After that came the weirder, slower stuff, and eventually public access shows that had the charm of homemade school projects. But you watched anyway, because it was something free, something yours. That old television with the static-filled sound and fuzzy picture was a window to a world that felt colorful and exciting, even if the reception was garbage. You adjusted the volume carefully so you did not wake anyone else in the house. And if your favorite show was coming on, you sat still like it was church. For those few hours, you were not poor, not tired, not worried about anything. You were just a kid living inside a cartoon. It was sacred, silly, but sacred. And the second it ended, you went outside, rerunning the episode in your head like a prized memory. Aluminum foil on rabbit ear antennas was every poor kid's first lesson in just make it work. The TV never had a great signal to begin with, and those antennas, thin metal rods sticking out like bug legs, were always bent, loose, or barely holding on. So someone, usually your dad or older sibling, would wrap foil around the tips, twisting and shaping it like it was some kind of science experiment. Did it help? Sometimes it made it worse. But you tried anyway, holding the antenna just right, standing at weird angles, praying for the static to clear. You would say, "There, right there, don't move," and then someone would walk by and ruin it. It was trial and error, every day. You learned patience, creativity, how to accept good enough. And once the picture settled, once that wavy black and white mess turned into a clear show, you felt like a genius, or at least lucky, because now you could watch the game, or the news, or cartoons, without spending a dime. That foil was not just about TV, it was about making do, about solving a problem with whatever you had on hand. And every household had that one person who could fix the picture like magic. Even if that magic was just a crumpled ball of foil and some stubborn hope. Using a rotary or push-button wall phone was like having a stubborn, slow-moving roommate. You had to be patient. Dialing took effort, especially if there were a lot of 8s and 9s in the number. You would stick your finger in, turn the wheel, and wait for it to spin all the way back. If you messed up, you had to start over. The cord was always too short, or too long and tangled, and it somehow wrapped itself around everything. You might have had to stand in the kitchen to talk, stretching the phone into the hallway so no one else could hear you. And if someone picked up the other line in the house, forget it. Instant embarrassment. But even with all that hassle, that phone was your lifeline. It was how your mom called relatives, how you ordered pizza when it was a special night, how you waited nervously for your friend to call after school. There was no caller ID, no texting, just a ring, and whoever answered was who you got. Conversations had weight, had pauses, you listened, you talked, you passed the phone back and forth like a precious object, and when you hung up, it was with a solid click that said the moment was done. You cannot replicate that now. You really cannot. Neighborhood swap meets and flea markets were poor kid Disneyland. You did not need a ticket, just a couple of coins and a good eye. Folding tables lined a church lot or a dusty field. Old clothes, rusty tools, toys missing pieces, books with worn covers. It was all there, and all up for grabs. You could trade, you could haggle, and sometimes you found something amazing. A working Walkman, a vintage comic, maybe a half-used bottle of perfume that still smelled like heaven. These were not just junk sales. They were treasure hunts. Your parents went looking for shoes, winter coats, kitchenware. You went looking for something shiny, something yours. And no one judged what you bought, because everyone was there for the same reason, to stretch $1 into something meaningful. The sellers were regular folks, sometimes neighbors, clearing out their basements and trunks for a few bucks. And every now and then, they would throw something in for free. "Go on, take it," they'd say with a wink. And you would smile like you just won the lottery. That feeling, that thrill of finding something good for almost nothing, stuck with you. Even now, it is hard to walk past a flea market without slowing down, because that memory of making a little money go a long way never really leaves. Saving S&H green. Stamps or coupons was basically extreme couponing before it was cool. You collected them everywhere, at the grocery store, the gas station, department stores. Little green stamps, sticky-backed and curled at the edges, waiting to be licked and stuck into a booklet. Your mom had a drawer full of them, or maybe a shoebox. Slowly, carefully, you filled the pages one by one. And when the book was full, you took it to a redemption center, a magical place that looked like a regular store but only dealt in dreams paid with stamps. You could get a toaster, a set of dishes, maybe even a clock radio if you saved enough. Coupons were their own game. You cut them out with dull scissors, sorted them by type, and carried them to the store like golden tickets. Double coupon day? That was the Super Bowl. And you learned young how to recognize a deal, how to stretch a meal, how to find value in places other people overlooked. These little slips of paper were quiet victories, proof that with enough patience, you could earn something real, something new. And when you finally walked out with that item you worked for, not with money, but with effort, it felt like winning a game no one else knew you were playing. Lunch meat was a luxury. Processed meat? That was the reality. Spam in a can, bologna in a plastic sleeve. They were the same salty, rubbery promise that you could make a sandwich, even if the bread was stale and the mayonnaise was thinning out. Fry it in a pan and suddenly it smelled like dinner. Cold or hot, it filled the plate and the belly. Kids brought it to school, wrapped in wax paper or old sandwich bags that barely held together. You could hear the judgment before the first bite, but you still ate it because you were hungry. And because that bologna, as weird as it was, tasted like home. Spam was even more of a marvel. Pull the key, peel back the metal, and there it was. Mystery meat molded to perfection. Fried spam and eggs, spam and rice, spam with macaroni. You did not question what was inside, you were just thankful something was. It was the flavor of survival, sealed in a metal rectangle. You made it stretch, you made it last. It was not glamorous, but it was yours. And in a world that often left you out of everything, that meant something. Wearing patches on clothes was less about style and more about grit. Holes in the knees, sewn shut with denim cut from old jeans, elbows wearing thin, covered in colorful scraps stitched with uneven lines and quiet determination. Every patch was a story, a game of tag gone too far, a tumble off a bike, a season of growth that stretched fabric past its limit. You did not throw things out, you fixed them. Because replacing a pair of pants was not always an option. Your mom had a sewing kit in an old cookie tin, filled with thread that never matched and buttons that had seen better days. She worked at the kitchen table, bent over your clothes like a surgeon, making something broken last just a little longer. You might have felt embarrassed. You might have tugged your sleeves to hide the stitching. But those patches were love in disguise. They meant someone cared enough to keep you dressed, even if the clothes were tired. They meant you kept going. Sometimes those patches were loud. Bright fabric that clashed with the shirt, a cartoon print stitched onto plain denim, whatever scrap was closest to the sewing basket. And sometimes they were nearly invisible, matched carefully to hide what had torn. Either way, you knew where they were. You could trace each one with your fingers. They scratched a little when new. They softened over time. On cold mornings, you sat still while your mom pinned a square over a frayed spot, asking you to hold your arms up or turn around so she could get it right. It was uncomfortable, but it meant you were cared for. No one wasted thread on clothes they did not plan to keep, and no one stayed up late mending knees if they did not believe you were worth the effort. Some patches covered wear and tear, others covered stains you could never quite get out. But all of them did the same thing. They gave your clothes a second life, and in the process, they gave you a quiet kind of dignity. You might not have had new clothes, but you had something better. Clothes that were saved, like you, again and again. And in a world where appearances mattered too much, patches were the proof that making do was still doing enough. You were worn, but you were whole. Twister was the game that got people off the couch and tangled in each other's limbs. Released in 1966, it came with a plastic mat covered in colored circles and a spinner that decided your next move. Left hand red, right foot green. Before you knew it, you were stretching across the mat in a precarious pose, face pressed against someone's knee, hoping no one slipped. It was silly, physical, and weirdly intimate. Some parents called it indecent. Some schools banned it. But kids loved it. So did teenagers. It broke the ice at parties, sparked laughter between siblings, and gave families something active to do together. It was as much about falling over as it was about winning. The rustle of the mat, the sound of giggles as someone toppled, the concentration in trying to stay upright, it was all part of the fun. Twister took no prep and delivered instant chaos. It did not care about strategy. It cared about balance, luck, and how far you could stretch without collapsing. And for many, it was the first time a game made you move, laugh, and fall down all in one messy, unforgettable moment. Shrinky dinks were magic in plastic form. You started with a sheet, clear, flexible, and begging to be colored. You grabbed your markers, drew a wild design, cut it out with safety scissors, and popped it in the oven. What came out was a tiny, hardened version of your masterpiece, often warped but always perfect. Watching it shrink behind the oven door was part of the thrill. You would kneel on the floor, peering through the glass, and gasp as your drawing curled, twisted, and finally flattened. Kids made keychains, jewelry, ornaments. Whatever their imagination allowed, it felt like crafting with sorcery. One minute, you were tracing cartoons or making friendship tags. The next, you held a miniaturized relic in your palm. The smell of melting plastic filled the kitchen. Parents worried, but no one stopped us. Shrinky dinks were affordable, creative, and wildly popular at every sleepover and birthday party. You could even buy branded kits, superheroes, cartoon characters, holiday themes. But the best ones were always your originals. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing your art transformed like that. Tiny, tough, and totally unique. We never questioned the process. We just knew it felt like creating something real, something small that still felt huge. That scarf your grandma made? It was love in yarn form, but also, it was all you had. Sweaters with sleeves that sagged, hats that itched, gloves without mates. You wore them anyway. They were handmade, which meant they were priceless, but also impossible to trade for something trendier. While your classmates had brand-name jackets with neon logos, you had a cardigan the color of mustard and maroon. It stood out. It always stood out. You told people it was vintage. You hoped they believed you. You wrapped yourself in the stitches of someone's time, someone's care, someone's refusal to let you be cold. It wasn't fashionable, but it was love you could wear. But you knew. Hand-knitted clothes told a different story. One of care. One of necessity. Someone spent hours making that sweater because they could not afford to buy you one. It was frugal. It was functional. It was one of the few things that kept you warm when money could not. And yes, sometimes it was embarrassing, but other times it reminded you that love could be worn and passed down. DIY haircuts at home were a gamble wrapped in a towel and held together by hope. The kitchen turned into a salon. A dining chair became the barber's throne. Mom or dad grabbed the dullest scissors in the drawer and told you to sit still. You did. Kind of. And snip by snip, your identity changed. Bangs went crooked. Sideburns vanished. One side always ended up shorter. They tilted your head like that would help. You watched the clumps fall, hoping for the best. Sometimes it ended in tears, sometimes in laughs, but most often in silence and a baseball cap. You went to school the next day pretending nothing happened, but everyone knew. They always knew. DIY haircuts were not about style. They were about saving $20 and making it stretch. Hair grew back, groceries did not. So you endured the bowl cuts, the buzz jobs, the too short layers that stuck out like antennas. You got used to it. And after a while, it became normal. A family ritual, a budget tradition. Looking back, those crooked cuts carried more than just uneven lines. They carried effort, sacrifice, and a strange kind of love that you only see when the hair starts to grow in. Tang was not just a drink. It was an icon of American space-age optimism. Though developed in 1957, it exploded into fame in the 1960s when NASA used it during Project Mercury and Gemini missions. Suddenly, drinking Tang meant more than just orange-flavored powder. It meant drinking like an astronaut. Kids begged their parents for it. Commercials showed bright pictures on sunny breakfast tables with the promise of vitamins and space-fueled energy. It came in a foil pouch, dissolved into water with a quick stir, and tasted like the future. The orange flavor was tangy, a little artificial, but full of excitement. Parents loved it for the no-mess prep and long shelf life. Children loved it because it made them feel connected to the cosmos. No one cared that it was mostly sugar and flavoring. Tang had a mission patch of approval. It became a staple in American pantries, always ready for a quick mix on a busy morning. By the end of the decade, it had grown into more than a drink. It was a symbol, a bright orange badge of the space race, proudly poured into plastic cups across the country. And for many, one sip still tastes like childhood and liftoff. In the 1970s, getting a TV signal felt like summoning the spirits. You did not just turn on the television and sit back, you had to work for it. That meant rabbit ears. That meant stretching, adjusting, and holding metal rods in every direction. And when the fuzz would not go away, there was only one solution: tin foil. It crinkled, it sparkled, and somehow it worked. Wrapped like a desperate science experiment, your television antenna became a sculpture of hope and frustration. You might remember your sibling being the designated antenna holder, standing on one leg, arm raised, frozen in place while the rest of the family watched. It was trial and error, comedy, and chaos. The goal? A clear picture, even if it only lasted 5 minutes. There were always threats not to move, begging someone not to breathe too hard, cheering when the static cleared, booing when it came back. It was not just about the picture, it was about the ritual, the teamwork, the sacrifice. You learned patience, you learned creativity. You learned that a ball of tin foil could mean the difference between watching your favorite show or sitting in silence. It was frustrating, ridiculous, and completely unforgettable. There were no drop-offs, no car doors opening to say goodbye. You walked, rain, snow, sun, whatever the sky decided, you just walked, or biked if you had one, not the shiny kind with pegs and stickers, the rusted kind. The hand-me-down two-wheeler with crooked handlebars and squeaky brakes, no helmet, no backup plan. The route to school became muscle memory. Past the same houses, same potholes, same barking dog. You learned how to make it to the front steps before the late bell rang, even if your shoes were soaked and your fingers numb. No one really asked why, everyone kind of knew. No gas money, no second car, no parent home in the morning to drive you. It was not dramatic. It was just how it was. If your friends got rides, you waved from the sidewalk, and maybe they waved back, maybe they looked away. Walking to school taught you more than just time management. It taught you to move through the world on your own 2 feet, even when they hurt. Reliance on government assistance programs was not a choice. It was the only way to get by. Food stamps came in paper booklets, torn out in the checkout line with quiet hands and sideways glances. School lunches were free, but they came with their own kind of price. Standing in a separate line, hearing the whispers, seeing the looks. You carried a different card, a different meal, a different kind of burden. The people behind the counter never said anything. But you knew. Everyone knew. At home, government cheese filled the fridge. Powdered milk sat on the shelf. The pantry was stocked with cans stamped from surplus stores, beans, peanut butter, cereal that tasted like cardboard but kept you full. Your parents made it stretch. They made it work. And they told you to hold your head up even when you wished you could vanish. Because pride does not feed a family. Assistance was not shameful. It was survival. It was how your shoes fit, how your stomach was full, how you still made it to class with something in your bag. And though some days it felt heavy, it also meant someone, somewhere, knew you were worth helping. Even when the world made you forget. Operation was not just a game, it was a test of nerves. Released by Milton Bradley in 1965, this battery-operated board game turned you into a surgeon, operating on a cartoonish patient named Cavity Sam. He lay there in his hospital gown, wide-eyed and helpless, with little cavities holding ailments like a funny bone, a wishbone, or a Charlie horse. The goal? Use tweezers to remove each piece without touching the metal edges of the cavity. If you slipped even slightly, the board buzzed loudly and Sam's red nose lit up. That buzz? It haunted dreams. Kids would wince, laugh, and shout all at once. The challenge was as much about steady hands as it was about keeping calm under pressure. Operation was competitive, silly, and oddly tense. You might remember tilting the board to cheat or holding your breath during a particularly tricky extraction. It was often pulled out during family game night, and even adults found themselves sweating over the tiny butterfly in the stomach. Operation was more than a toy. It was an experience, a rite of passage. And the first time many kids learned that success sometimes comes down to keeping a steady hand. The Viewmaster was not just a toy, it was a portal. You held it up to your face like binoculars, clicked the lever, and entered a new world, one tiny slide at a time. These were not just pictures. They were 3D windows into places you had never been and shows you loved. Suddenly, Bugs Bunny was popping out at you. You were walking through Disneyland or swimming under the sea. The images were bright, bold, and vivid, especially when the sunlight hit just right. The reels came in paper packets, labeled like treasure maps, each one promising a new adventure, and you kept them all, in shoeboxes, in drawers, maybe scattered across the floor until your mom made you pick them up. The Viewmaster made you feel like a traveler, even if you never left your room. It was quiet entertainment. No batteries, no wires, no screens. Just your imagination and a satisfying click with every slide. The joy was in the anticipation. What will the next picture be? Where will I go next? You could spend hours lost in it. You remember how your arms got tired, but you kept clicking. One more reel. One more journey. Because for those few minutes, the world was just you and the magic inside that plastic viewer. You could smell it before you opened the box. A big orange brick. No label, no brand, just cheese. It came from the government, which made it sound official, but it felt more like a secret. You stood in long lines at the community center or church basement to get it. People avoided eye contact. No one wanted to admit they were there for the same reason. When you got home, the block was heavy, dense, like a promise that this week might be okay. It did not melt like normal cheese. It clung to pans, stuck to knives, and burned if you looked at it wrong. But it was cheese. It worked. Grilled cheese, casseroles, sandwiches for school. It made plain bread feel like a meal. It didn't taste like comfort food, but it was comfort. And when things were really bad, even that brick felt like a small miracle. And for families that had little else, that was everything. The taste became familiar, then comforting, maybe even nostalgic. It was a flavor tied to both struggle and safety. You never forgot that box, or how it felt to need it. Limited or no air conditioning meant summer nights were a battle with the heat. The box fan sat in the window, humming like a tired engine, barely moving the thick air. You sweated through your sheets, drank warm water, slept with the lights off and the windows wide open, hoping for a breeze that never came. Some homes had one window unit, and it stayed in the living room. Everyone gathered there like refugees from the sun. No one moved. The couch was soaked in humidity. Tempers flared, ice trays emptied fast. You wore as little as possible, stuck your head in the fridge, and counted the hours until dark. At school, kids talked about central air. You could not imagine it. The idea of a whole house being cool felt like science fiction. You made popsicles out of juice in ice cube trays. You wrapped wet washcloths around your neck. You laid on the floor, hoping the tile was cooler than the bed. And through it all, you survived. Uncomfortable, sticky, and half asleep, but alive. No air conditioning was not ideal, but it made you tough, and it taught you how to endure heat, not just in your house, but in life. Rotary phones were more than a way to talk. They were a ritual. Heavy, anchored to a table or wall and connected by a coiled cord, these phones had a satisfying weight and a rhythm all their own. Each number you dialed had to be carefully selected with a finger, spun around the circular dial, and released with a soft whir. If you dialed the wrong digit near the end, start over. It took patience, and that was part of the charm. You memorized numbers, you waited your turn, and when the phone rang, it was a real ring, loud, metallic, and impossible to ignore. Talking on the rotary phone meant stretching the cord down the hallway for privacy, wrapping it around your fingers during a long conversation, and sometimes having to politely ask someone to hang up because it was your turn to use it. There were no voicemails, no caller ID, just trust, timing, and the occasional busy signal. Today, a rotary phone feels like a relic, but for many growing up in the 1960s, it was a constant companion. From late-night talks to awkward first calls, its clicks and clatters are etched in memory like the voices it once carried. Long before music was digital, it spun on plastic. Record players with built-in speakers were the backbone of every teenager's room and every family living room. They were bulky, boxy, and usually brown or beige. But when you placed that needle on the groove, the room changed. You might remember hearing the Jackson 5, the Carpenters, or Fleetwood Mac for the very first time through one of these machines. The sound was warm, slightly fuzzy, and crackled at the edges, but it was alive. Kids would stack their 45s, adjust the tone arm, and lower the needle with care. These were not sleek devices. They were furniture. Some had lids that closed like a suitcase. Others had knobs you had to gently coax into the right spot. Volume? Not much. But intimacy? All the way. You sat close to it. You knew every skip and scratch on your favorite record. You could play the same song 10 times in a row and it felt new every time. It was not about convenience, it was about connection. The record player was not background noise, it was the centerpiece of your downtime. Hearing one today might just make you stop, listen, and remember who you were when that song first played. Heat in the 1980s was not something you escaped. It was something you endured. Poor meant you did not have central air. You had fans. One in the window that never really fit. Another that oscillated like it was too tired to commit. You would lay still at night, drenched in sweat, praying for a breeze that never came. Ice trays became currency. Cold washcloths went on foreheads like war bandages. And opening the front door was not just about fresh air, it was survival. Kids played outside not because it was fun, but because it was cooler in the shade than it was inside. You kept the curtains closed, the lights off, and your patience thinner than your summer sheets. You were not just sweating, you were surviving. The summer heat became your constant, suffocating roommate. You might have visited someone who had air conditioning and wondered how they lived in such luxury. Cooled air, dry clothes, no noise but the gentle hum of comfort. Back at home, the sound was different. It was the buzz of old fans, the click of sweaty skin, the low groan of a family trying to pretend the heat was not a problem. You slept in front of that fan like it was a life raft, but it was not enough, and there was nothing you could do about it. Homemade cleaning solutions were born from necessity, not Pinterest boards. You did not run to the store for name brand cleaners. You went to the pantry, vinegar, baking soda, lemon juice, and hot water. That was your cleaning aisle. Floors were scrubbed with water and salt. Windows sparkled from a vinegar and newspaper combo. Stains were tackled with whatever you had on hand, even if it was club soda or a bar of soap worn down to a sliver. Your mom had recipes memorized, passed down from her mom, who probably learned it from someone who survived the Depression. There were no colorful spray bottles or lemon-scented chemicals, just jars and rags and effort. And it worked. The house was clean, not just surface clean, but deep cleaned with elbow grease and frugality. The scent was not artificial, it was honest, and somehow it made the place feel even more like home. Because cleaning was not about appearances, it was about taking care of what little you had. Homemade solutions taught you that expensive did not always mean better, that old tricks still worked, and that sometimes the best kind of clean comes from the simplest mix of ingredients and willpower. G.I. Joe changed everything the moment he marched onto toy shelves in 1964. Marketed not as a doll, but as an action figure, he offered boys the same kind of character-driven play that girls had with Barbie, but with a combat boot twist. The original 12-inch figure came with a military uniform, dog tags, and enough flexibility to strike a pose or take a fall. Kids could swap out his gear, helmets, rifles, backpacks, even scuba suits, and send him off on missions across the living room or backyard battlefield. It was the height of the Cold War, and Joe reflected that tension, but filtered through a child's sense of adventure. Over time, he evolved into a whole universe of characters, vehicles, and storylines. But those first editions were pure, iconic, and endlessly played with. G.I. Joe was a soldier, a sailor, an adventurer. He climbed trees, dove into mud puddles, and slept in shoebox barracks. For many boys growing up in the 1960s, he was the first toy that truly felt like theirs. He was more than plastic. He was valor, imagination, and action rolled into one heroic pose. And every kid who owned one remembers how it felt to gear him up for battle. Before Bluetooth speakers and streaming playlists, there was the Fisher-Price record player, and it was a masterpiece of childhood simplicity. You wound it up with a chunky white knob and placed a thick plastic disc on the turntable. It clicked into place, and when the needle dropped, the magic began. Out came twinkly, music box-style versions of nursery rhymes, folk songs, and lullabies. The songs were short, cheerful, and unforgettable. The discs were colorful and clunky, with molded ridges that somehow produced melodies. It did not matter if the sound was a little warped or off-key. You were in control. You had your own music machine. For many kids, this was their first experience playing music, and the pride that came with it was unmatched. You could stack your favorite discs. You could play the same one on repeat until it drove your parents up the wall. And the best part? No batteries. Just your hands, your ears, and your imagination. You did not need to understand how it worked. You just needed to hear that familiar click, feel the turn of the crank, and know that something sweet was about to happen. It was low-tech joy in a beige plastic box, and it never stopped playing in our heads. You waited your turn, always. And by the time you got it, the water was cold and murky. But it was still a bath. The first kid in got the best of it, the second made do, the third rinsed off in someone else's week. It was not gross. It was normal. Water was expensive, heating it even more so. Baths were not about luxury. They were about rationing. One tub, one bucket of hot water, 3 kids, maybe more. You learned to bathe in silence with no complaints because silence was cheaper than hot water. Clean wasn't about comfort. It was about calculation. You scrubbed fast. You never splashed. Soap was passed like a baton. Towels reused until they barely absorbed. This was not about being dirty. It was about surviving clean. Poor meant you counted the cost of every drop. And privacy? That was a different kind of luxury. You laughed about it later, maybe. But at the time, it taught you something. How to wait. How to stretch. How to make do with less, way less. The water might have been shared, but the lesson was yours alone. Etch-a-Sketch was a toy box essential for many kids growing up in the 1960s, a red-framed tablet that made art out of turning two little white knobs. Created in France and introduced to the American market in 1960, it was as magical as it was mechanical. There were no batteries, no screens, no noise, just pure possibility inside that gray, powder-filled screen. The left knob controlled horizontal lines. The right knob handled vertical ones. And with patience and lots of do-overs, you could draw a house, a name, even a passable Mickey Mouse. But here's the kicker. If you messed up, you just shook the thing. That satisfying rattle erased the entire image in an instant, giving you a clean slate. It was frustrating. It was addictive. It was mesmerizing. You might remember twisting the knob so hard your fingers hurt, trying to make curves when all it wanted to give you was straight lines. Yet when you finally got something to look just right, the pride was real. Etch-a-Sketch was art, logic, and trial and error rolled into one simple frame. In a world of ever-evolving toys, this one stayed still, and that was its power. Using public transportation exclusively meant your life moved on someone else's schedule. There was no jumping in the car for milk, no last-minute rides. You waited. At bus stops, on corners, in the rain, in the cold, in your Sunday best or your work shoes. The bus was never early. Sometimes it was late. But you waited. You held a pocket full of exact change. Maybe a transfer stub. You knew the routes like the back of your hand. You sat near the front if you were tired. In the back if you did not want to talk. You watched strangers argue, laugh, cry. You saw your city from a different view, block by block, stop by stop. Owning a car seemed like another world. Gas, insurance, repairs. Those were luxuries. The bus was what you had. And it was enough. Sort of. It got you to school, to work, to church. You learned to carry groceries in bags that would not break. You made friends with the drivers. You memorized delays. And when the ride was over, you stepped off into whatever came next. Public transportation did not just move you. It taught you patience, resilience, and how to hold on when the brakes hit hard. If any of this brought back memories or made you feel seen, drop your favorite moment in the comments, give us a like to keep the stories alive, and subscribe so you never miss another trip back home.